Remember that movie Orphan? It was relatively popular when it was released. Everyone seemed to like it, and even I thought it was surprisingly good. The storyline itself is basically what you'd expect. It's one of those movies where you look at the cover and you'll basically get the gist of the whole movie. It's about an orphan that kills people. What else would you expect? I saw it sometime after its release date, but I can't pinpoint the exact time. All I know is I saw it in 2010, and that's already, 12 years ago? Jesus, where'd the time go? Till this day, I'll never forget the impression this film left on me when I first saw it, especially when comparing it to all the movies in that same era. I sincerely believe that the 2000s was just a god-awful time for horror movies, and my opinion has never really changed on that. It's like after the 20th century, originality just totally went down the shitter. Like, on one hand, the genre just became oversaturated with remakes because nobody could come up with an idea on their own, so the go-to method was to rely on someone else's. But then there was the torture genre, where it seemed like the goal wasn't to actually scare people, but instead to shock them with horrific torture scenes. And it's like, yeah, okay, we get it. It was fun the first few times, but enough is enough already. But at the end of the day, what really pissed me off was the ridiculous overabundance of ghost and demon-related movies. You cannot watch a single trailer to an upcoming horror film without it either being a haunted house movie or a ghost story or a religious demon-themed story, and they all look identical from one another. They usually either rip off films like The Exorcist or Amityville Horror, and another thing I notice is they constantly use jump scares, and it's usually because the filmmakers don't have the talent to rely on anything else. And again, if I watch a trailer to these movies, I cannot tell one apart from another, because quite frankly, after a while, they all just blend in with each other. Like, there's no real willpower to try and create and make these movies distinctive or interesting. And that is one thing I have to say I absolutely loved about the movie Orphan. It was like a breath of fresh air. It's like, finally, we have an original movie that's about a killer. It's not about a haunted house. There's no demon possessing someone or something. There's no CGI monster, and it doesn't rip off The Grudge. It's simply about a killer. And for me, that was just so refreshing to see for once. For what it's worth, Orphan is basically your contemporary slasher film. And it's funny because I feel like the slasher genre always gets a bad rap from people. It seems like specifically in the 2000s, slasher films were frowned upon. I guess because people felt like they were played out. Yeah, okay. So we'll just pretend that the 9 billion ghost and demon flicks haven't been played out either. Okay, whatever. But it seems like slasher films were starting to get this reputation where you bring it up to someone and they always say, oh, those movies are all the same, you know, just a bunch of dumb teenagers go out in the woods and have sex or whatever and blah, 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 blah. But the thing is, that's not always the case. People seem to forget that some of the greatest horror films of all time were slasher movies. Remember Psycho with Janet Leigh? That was a slasher flick. And not to mention, it basically revolutionized the horror genre. How about Black Christmas from 1974? Did you watch that? That's another movie that falls under the slasher category, and it's also very good and very underrated. So I would throw Orphan in a similar category to those movies. Why not? While I'm not going to say it's a perfect film, it's well made, it's well written, it has a distinctive look, and in my opinion, it has a great villain. The storyline involves a grief-stricken family that's looking to adopt a kid. The lead role is the mother, named Kate, who's played by Vera Farmiga. She suffers from a certain level of PTSD over the loss of her third child during pregnancy. So the idea comes along to adopt a kid, I guess to help fill the void in her life, and, I guess that having 2 kids wasn't enough apparently. So Kate and her husband John go to the local orphanage where they meet Esther, a 9-year-old girl played by Isabelle Fuhrman. She's highly intelligent, and she's also artistic. We could see that she stands out from the rest of the kids in the group, but it seems to be in a positive sense. She leaves a good enough impression on Kate and John to where they don't even second-guess their decision. They adopt Esther and introduce her to the rest of the family. There's the oldest son named Daniel, and then there's the youngest daughter named Max. When I first saw this movie, I hated the older brother so much. I thought he was such a prick.
Can you eat normal? Wasn't asking you. Such a freak. Hey. Maybe you should send her back to the retard camp where she belongs. She's not my fucking sister.
He's very rude and unwelcoming to Esther, and there's a couple of scenes where he just outright bullies her. Then later, she gets bullied by girls in her age group. It almost fools you into feeling sympathetic for her. But it doesn't take long for that to change. Things escalate pretty damn quickly. She starts showing signs of psychopathic behavior. The mother, Kate, starts to notice that something's off with her, but then there's that classic movie formula where she's the only one who sees it, and nobody believes her. On top of that, Esther uses this as an opportunity to make Kate look crazy. There's even a really messed up scene where Esther breaks her own wrist to make it look like Kate physically harmed her. And I have to say, it's very rare when a scene from a movie is so extreme that I have to look away. But you know what? That's another thing I like about this movie. It has balls. It doesn't hold back like one of those PG-13 type of horror films. This film is just off the wall crazy. There are certain parts that are just shockingly gruesome. And I also feel like with most horror films, there always seems to be that cliche where little kids are off limits. But this film basically says, screw that. If you're putting kids in this movie, we're teaching them a lesson. There's one part where Esther terrorizes the older brother in the middle of the night.
If I find out that you're lying, I'll cut your hairless little prick off before you even figure out what it's for.
I don't think there's a more horrific way you could threaten a man. There are conventions here that remind me of other movies. It actually reminds me of The Good Son with Macaulay Culkin from 1993, and there's even some small fragments that remind me of movies like Hand That Rocks the Cradle. I just get a strong vibe that the movie Orphan was heavily influenced by those type of 90s thrillers. And as far as dumb scare tactics are concerned, like jump scares, what this film relies on, I don't even know if it qualifies as jump scares. Instead, they do that thing with the false alarms. Every so often, there's a build-up, and you think that something bad is going to happen, but then nothing. And they do this constantly throughout the movie. It gets to the point where it almost starts to feel like a gag. And when I say that it happens constantly, I mean it happens every 5 seconds. There's also a recurring theme where Esther's trying to get close to the father. We could see that her goal is to turn him against Kate. This would lead one to believe that Esther has some kind of daddy issues, but let's not jump the gun yet. Of course, she also ends up killing people. She racks up a small body count, nothing too extreme. She kills about 2 people in the movie, basically the same as Psycho. Although if you go by Esther's backstory, she's killed other people in the past. It turns out that the previous family Esther lived with died in a house fire, so we could see that there's a pattern here, where every time a family takes her in, they mysteriously die. And that begs the question, what's her motive? Well, time for spoilers. If you haven't watched the film yet, and you want to be surprised, then stop the video right here. It turns out in a shocking plot twist that Esther is not in fact a 9-year-old girl, but rather a 33-year-old woman. She has a rare condition that affects her pituitary gland, which inhibits her from aging. The condition is known as hypopituitarism, and let me tell you, that was not an easy word to pronounce. So this whole time, Esther has been posing as a kid and fooling everyone. And we see now that her goal wasn't just to earn the father's affection, but also to seduce him. When I first saw this movie, I thought that this was the craziest and most over-the-top kind of plot twist they could have possibly given it. And to be honest, at that time, I didn't even think it was necessary. But looking back now, I actually like the fact that they added this twist because on some weird level, I like the fact that it's so over-the-top and crazy. And I think that it fits in with the rest of the movie. I also like how we find out that this whole time Esther's been dolling herself up to look like a child by covering up her wrinkles and scars with makeup, almost like she's creating an illusion or wearing a mask, you know, like your typical slasher villain. And I always find it compelling where the movie villain has to disguise their true identity in order to fit in with society. Now, in regards to things I don't like about this movie, there's not much that hinders the experience for me. Although I will say that some of the characters are insufferable, and when I say some of the characters, I mean most of them, like a good 90%. The husband is probably the worst one of all. He's a total douche. He's one of those characters that becomes so obnoxious that you find yourself rooting for his death. He spends the entire film contradicting Kate every step of the way, and he never misses a moment to treat her like she's the bad guy. He also falls for every one of Esther's manipulations, hook, line, and sinker, because he's a fucking half-wit. I mean, his level of stupidity is actually incredible. After a while, it almost starts to feel like a comedy routine, because it doesn't matter how many times Kate tries to connect the dots for him, he still doesn't get it because he's a thick-headed chode. You would think that most people in his situation would have the ability to put 2 and 2 together, but unfortunately in his case, I think 2 and 2 means he has a total of 4 brain cells in his head. And unfortunately, some of the other characters are not far off. There's a scene with a therapist who happens to share that same stupidity. She doesn't even attempt to hear Kate's side of the story. She completely takes Esther's side. You would think that a woman with her quote-unquote expertise would have the ability to see what's really going on, but instead she's just as much of an airhead as the husband. I mean, what really baffles me is how no one else even thinks to question the situation with Esther. Like, I would think from a common sense viewpoint that most people in this situation would take a step back and say, okay, we've noticed a change ever since this person came into our lives, and bad things have started to happen that specifically surround her. But no one even notices the pattern. Instead, according to them, it's all Kate's fault because she's an alcoholic. Yeah, okay, whatever. Again, I find it kind of funny because it's like, how does Kate end up being surrounded by so many dumb people? And even she's not exactly the brightest bulb in the case. To be honest, the only person I really root for is the youngest daughter named Max. She's really the only other person who's aware of Esther's true nature, but she plays it smart and she pretends she's on Esther's side, sort of like a survival tactic. You know, making sure that she doesn't see her as a threat. Now, on the subject of things I don't like, let me say this. One complaint I have is with the ending. For those of you who don't know, there are 2 endings. One where Kate kills Esther by the frozen pond, which they made the official ending. Then there's the alternate ending, which you could find on YouTube. In the alternate version, the police show up at the house and Esther is still alive. So she goes to her room to doll herself up again, and then she comes out and greets the police officers like nothing happened. There's something very disturbing about it. I don't know about you, but I think that this is a far better ending than the one they chose. There's something chilling about it because it mainly shows that Esther is out of touch with reality. She's not just a killer, she's completely insane. So it doesn't even matter that she's been caught. You could tell that it doesn't faze her. So it begs the question, is she putting on this fake persona for the police or for her own sense of comfort? I don't know about you, but I'm going with the latter. I also like the fact that this is open-ended. Unlike the official ending where she's killed off, in the alternate ending it leaves you with an unsettling note where even though she's caught, it doesn't mean that she's out of the picture. And also the fact that she dolls herself up again means that the cycle is bound to repeat itself. But the ending they officially went with just wrapped everything up with a nice little bow in typical Hollywood fashion. Also, you could see that the ending they chose had a much bigger budget with more special effects. So I assume that this was a factor that went into their decision making. But interestingly enough, notice how the alternate ending didn't have a crazy climax that needed a big budget or, all those special effects. Yet, in my opinion, it was more interesting and more compelling. I'm one of these people that firmly believes that less is more. But all that aside, like I said in the beginning of the video, I like this movie. For what it is and what it has to offer, it has a distinctive look, which I appreciate. I like the fact that it's set in a cold climate where it's always snowing. It helps convey that morbid feeling of death. It gives you a certain theme to associate this film with. Of course, there are also memorable highlights. I like the part where Esther makes these glow-in-the-dark paintings, and there are also some memorable images that stand out in my mind, like that shot of Esther smiling at the burning treehouse. But the real highlight of the movie for me is the character Esther. Isabelle Fuhrman really knocks it out of the park. Personally, I don't think that anyone could have handled the role better than she did. There's something very creepy about her, but not in a way that's over the top. The way that Esther's creepy is in a rather subtle way. There's a coldness to her, where you could tell that she lacks any real sense of empathy or remorse. But at the same time, she also exudes charisma, and I would even go so far as to say that there's a sadness to her, which makes her more compelling. Aside from the obvious fact that she's lonely, we could see that she's also tormented by the condition she has to live with. And I find that some of the greatest movie monsters are usually the ones that have a sadness to them, some kind of tragic nature to their existence that makes them who they are. I definitely recommend this film to anyone who's a horror fan, especially if you're the type who likes movies like Psycho. While Orphan didn't necessarily do anything groundbreaking, and it certainly didn't revolutionize the genre in any way, it's still a good movie, and it's well worth the praise that people have given it over the years. And yes, I would even go so far as to say that Esther is the definitive slasher villain of the 2000s. Prove me wrong. Name me one other character from a horror film that's not a remake, not a torture film, and not some ghost or demon related flick. Name me one other person who's made as big an impact as her in the last 22 years. Seriously, I'll be waiting.